Hello, I'm P. Andrew Sandlin, founder and president of the Center for Cultural Leadership. My topic today is two liberalisms, two illiberalisms. The first liberalism I'd like to talk about is the one that emerged first historically, and it's known, in fact, as classical liberalism. It grew out of the worldview of the Protestant Reformation, the socio-political implications of the theological distinctives of the Protestant Reformation, as fused with the early English Enlightenment. It's probably fair to say that there are seeds of it late in the 17th century, the 1600s, going on into the 1700s for sure, and then in the mid and late 1700s, the 18th century, with the founding of the United States, it really begins to flourish, not just there, but principally there. It actually had earlier precedent, though, in England at Runnymede with the Magna Carta and the kings being forced to make concessions to the various nobles. And before that, and more importantly, in the Hebrew Scriptures, which stressed what we today call blind justice, fair, equal weights and measures, honesty in economic dealings, fairness, everyone treated the same according to the law in the courts. Foreigners, we might say immigrants, subject to the same law as citizens in the Jewish Republic, and even more so. We see this in the New Covenant era, the Christian New Testament. We see it in Romans chapter 13. The responsibility of the state is almost entirely negative, that is, punishing evildoers. The goal of the state is not providing some great national vision of what everyone should believe. And then Peter's later statement that we should be praying as believers that we'll just live a quiet and peaceful life, that the government, what we call politics, the state, should stay out of our business as long as we operate broadly within the rule of law. So I've just sort of drifted slowly and inferentially into the main distinctive of classical liberalism, which is essentially individual liberty, the right of the individual within law. There's no anarchy permitted, of course, but within law, individuals are permitted to live as they see fit. I said we really see this in the American founding. Think about the Declaration of Independence, if you will. And the role of the government, the state, is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Originally, at the time, in the 18th century, it was life, liberty, and property, the sanctity of property. But the point is that this was just a remarkable idea at the time. It looks much less remarkable to us today because we're accustomed to it, but almost all societies historically were coterminous with the state or with politics. You were born into a society, and you were born into, therefore, a political context, because politics was essentially coterminous with society, and you found your place there. More accurately, a place was found for you there. But the founders turned that idea on its head. For them, the role of the state, the role of politics, is not to provide some great national vision into which everybody under their tutelage should conform, but rather is to protect the individuals within the society. That's a great distinctive of classical liberalism. Then there's that we'll call that vision classical liberalism, and that's what it's known as today. Next, we can mention modern liberalism. Now, strangely, late in the 19th century, these classically liberal ideas morphed into very different ideas. Liberalism began to mean something very different. Classical liberalism always is strongly opposed to the consolidation of power, particularly political power, and that's why classical liberals always believed in the division of powers, the division of federal power into the three branches of government, judicial, legislative, and executive. So, and in addition to that, what I alluded to earlier, these ideas of a level playing field. Almost always there's a constitution and a Bill of Rights, prohibition of excessive punishment, and unlawful search and seizure, and an adversarial court system. The system is not stacked against the accused. He at least has the right of he or she the right of representation. These are all classically liberal ideas, as well as individual liberty, more importantly, religious liberty, free markets, universal reason, universal moral standards that can't change just because there's a new election. So on this point, the modern liberals largely agreed. But what changed with late in the 19th, early 20th century is that some liberals began to become more concerned about the consolidation of economic power, which they saw in big business, than they did in political power, which is what the original classical liberals believed. And so they began to argue that it's necessary to use state power to break a more dangerous, pernicious power, which is consolidated economic power. Well, this is where we get FDR, who leaned towards socialism. And in the 1960s, of course, the Great Society of Lyndon B. Johnson. These are what we would call modern liberals. Perhaps the first modern liberal, because of one other particular distinctive, would be Woodrow Wilson. He was the first political utopian to occupy the White House. He believed that he and very smart people could spawn out of their own gifted rationality what a just society should look like. And this notion is with us today. Thomas Sowell calls it the vision of the anointed, or the unconstrained vision. Now, so this modern form of liberalism looks very different from classical liberalism because of its strong emphasis on the economic redistributionary powers of the state. So today in the United States, if you asked who are prominent liberals, people in the know might well answer, well, Barack Obama or Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi, and they would be correct. They would be modern liberals, not classical liberals. So that's classical liberalism and modern liberalism. Now let's go to the illiberalisms. Illiberalism means deprivation of a liberty for the purpose of meeting a greater or higher end. I'm going to take these in chronologically reverse order, unlike the liberalisms, and talk about the most recent one. This illiberalism is dominant in our society. It's the great social vision in virtually all the major universities, public and private. Many of the well-heeled, endowed foundations, in all the major newsrooms, cable and network, virtually all newspapers, though newspapers are dying, and in many churches. And I can also say it is the predominant vision now in the Democratic Party. And that is cultural Marxism. Some people would call it Western Marxism or neo-Marxism or existential Marxism, revisionist Marxism. Probably began with Trotsky, although not in any primary sense. The real father, apart from Marx, which I'll get to in a minute, is the Italian, actually Sardinian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, and then with the Weimar Republic German communist Marxists, Erich Fromm and Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. Likely the most brilliant of all, more brilliant than Marx, is the Hungarian cultural Marxist George Lukács. These cultural Marxists are distinguished from the classical Marxists in that while the classical Marxists stressed equality economically, these stress cultural equality, particularly tearing down all hierarchy and privilege. In the Western world, the Christian world, who's been privileged? Well, males, particularly white males, and so they support radical ideological feminism. All the same is true with heterosexuality, which has been privileged, so they're very pro-homosexual. They're very strong into environmental causes because they don't believe that man should be privileged in the environment, that the quote, the environment is just as important as man. So there are these constant attempts to embrace what the Australian conservative calls the oppression-liberation nexus. They're always looking around, the cultural Marxists, for people that are oppressed and need to be liberated. And if there aren't actual ones, they have to invent them. This cultural Marxism speaks of toxic masculinity and speaks again and again of white privilege. It believes that anybody that stands for marriage, what's called traditional marriage, is just marriage, one man with one woman, is homophobic. They're strongly in favor of conquering climate change because they want greater government power. But a chief aspect and chief distinctive of the cultural Marxists is that their goal is to capture society, not by means of capturing the state in a violent way, as Lenin did in Russia in 1917 and as Mao did in China in the late 1940s, but to do it culturally through the statement attributed to Gramsci, though he himself didn't hold it, the long march through the institutions. So little by little, they'll try to capture newspapers, not so much newspapers today, as websites, news organizations, journalism, certainly education, and even the science, fields of science, Hollywood for sure. Politics, though that's not their principal concern. The victory in politics will come in the end for them when they capture all the other institutions. That's cultural Marxism, a form of illiberalism, because essentially what they say is they know what the just society looks like. Their goal is to level everything, and if you get in their way, then they'll use politics in order to crush you. So they're not about liberty for individuals. They're basically about using the state to destroy liberty within the framework of law, to rewrite the law, to rig the law in order to create a particular kind of just society, by which they mean a society we could call of expressivist individualism. You can express yourself and your gayness or your any sort of imaginary view that you have of how you really should be. That should be legally permitted, and not just legally permitted, but it should be required that you are recognized, that you're not simply tolerated, that you're celebrated. So that's the first illiberalism. Now the latest is a revival of an earlier liberalism. We would call this conservative illiberalism. It's now being touted by, I'm sad to say, First Things magazine and people who tend to agree with them. Some people we would say at the American Conservative, Chronicles magazine, not everybody in those places. I want to be careful here. But this is an idea that, which I'll get to in a minute, is actually rooted, at least in the 20th century, in continental thinkers, far-right continental thinkers like Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt, These thinkers believe strongly in blood and soil, that the important thing is that the people of the same ethnicity and the same general families and the same color and the same language all should have a cohesiveness and protect themselves and should be given special rights and privileges, and everybody, if they don't like it, they can go somewhere else, essentially. There's also the throne and altar aspect of this, the old idea of the union of church and state, medieval union of church and state. For classical liberalism, there's a genuine separation of church and state, not the separation of the state from God. No early classical liberal or any true one today would ever hold that. All of life is inherently religious, but that doesn't mean that the church should control or dictate things, or theologians should dictate things. The goal of the state is basically to stay out of everybody's business and penalize people who try to harm others, who are simply trying to obey the law. But that's not enough for the new illiberal conservatives. Their view is that classical liberalism has permitted all of this cultural Marxism, and so their view is not to return to classical liberalism and do a better job of persuading, but to capture certain aspects of the state in order to impose a high order form of federalism, that the nation state itself has a grand vision for society and everybody should conform to that vision. We've actually had a lot of examples of that historically. Most of them have not been good. Ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, in fact, all of the ancient empires, the Roman Empire and Persia, the Greek Empire, and of course others historically in the medieval era. But these illiberal conservatives, conservative illiberals, are convinced that the American experiment, or at least they're hinting, the American experiment has been a failure, or it now is not going to serve us well anymore. And therefore what we desperately need is what Heideggerians would call a politics of meaning. And we need true conservatives, true Christians to join together to crush everyone else so that we have the truly right society. There's nothing particularly Christian about that at all, because Christianity views the state in a much more marginal light. It's not radically libertarian by any means. The state does have a role to play, but overall a very minor role. Classical liberals stress civil society, individuals and families and churches and businesses and so on, and not the state. As Christians, we believe that we'll win only by persuasion, because we don't need political power behind us, the political power to impose a particular Christian will. We don't need that, because we have the power of the gospel and the power of the Holy Spirit of God. So essentially what the conservative illiberals are saying, even those that are Christian among its number, most of them are Roman Catholics, not all, is that we can't really trust the gospel. We can't really trust the Holy Spirit. We need sort of public declarations and enshrining Christianity somehow in federal documents. That really, though unintentionally, smacks of unbelief. So these four are four categories prominent today sociopolitically. The two liberalisms, classical liberalism and modern liberalism, and the two illiberalisms, cultural Marxism and conservative illiberalism, we could call it. I conclude with this. Tragically, the ascendant visions are the last two, the illiberalisms. Classical liberalism is in retreat almost everywhere. Even modern liberalism, as you would see it in the Democratic Party, marginally by people, the quote moderates like Joe Biden, are getting thumped. Classical liberals, modern liberals like JFK, and more recent ones, Joe Lieberman, there'd be no place for them in today's Democratic Party, because today's Democratic Party is committed to classical liberalism, is committed to cultural Marxism, rather. And then sadly, the illiberal conservatives wish to drive out the classical liberals. That is, in many ways, modern conservatives, because they believe in the power of nationhood, nationalism, and the state. The Christian approach, though no political ideology is infallible, but the one more in line with the Bible and historic Christianity is classical liberalism. This has kind of been a long talk. I hope you followed me along the way. You can always email or call me if you need more information, but please share this if you think it'll help someone in navigating through the maze, or perhaps we could say minefield, of today's sociopolitics. Okay, I'm P. Andrew Sandlin. Check out CCL, Center for Cultural Leadership, at christianculture.com.